Yo, what's up guys? Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a full in-depth deck breakdown of a deck that I've recently used to get top 20 with on the arena ladder in best of one, and that is my red-green Turbo-Emissary deck. Now, as you can see from the screenshot, I'm currently 35-9 with the deck, and I'm pretty sure that 4 or 5 of those losses were punts on my part as well, so the deck has felt really strong to me. Now, every video I've made so far on decks has always been on best of 3 because that's predominantly what I play. And I always get questions from people asking how I would adapt my best of 3 decks to best of 1, and I always find that quite a difficult question to answer because I feel like the metagames in best of 1 and best of 3 in Historic are pretty different. There's a bunch of decks that are pretty common in best of 1 in Historic that basically don't see any play in best of 3 because they get hosed really badly by sideboard cards, and then occasionally there are also some best of 3 decks that don't really get play in best of 1 because they rely on their sideboard in order to win in certain matchups. Now typically, like I said, I usually play best of 3 because I feel like there's just a bunch of additional variants in best of 1 that's out of your control. But the one thing I really do like about best of 1 is that it's a space for certain decks to exist that can't exist in best of 3 because of sideboard hate. And additionally, it's a space for certain builds of decks to exist that are a lot more linear and a lot more hyper-focused on their strategy. Because if you run a deck that is really hyper-focused and really linear on one strategy, if the opponent has a way in their sideboard to counter that strategy, it kind of shuts off your entire deck. So because of that, you know, rather than just porting best of 3 decks to best of 1 and making them a bit more linear, which I think is kind of boring and doesn't really add anything to the format, when I do play best of 1, I'm always looking for interesting decks that can only really exist in best of 1 because they're really linear and really focused on what they're doing, and this deck is a good example of that. So going forward, I am predominantly going to be making best of 3 videos, but when I do play best of 1, I'm going to be trying to make decks that are kind of exclusive to best of 1, and more importantly for those players who do play best of 1, I'm going to make them specifically built for the best of 1 metagame, because like I said, I feel like the best of 3 decks I make probably aren't the best in best of 1 because they're not hyper focused, and they also don't take into account a lot of the decks that are common in best of 1, like Dragonstorm Ultimatum, for example. So before I get into it, there's going to be a Scryfall link down in the description. If you click on that, it'll have the full deck list there that you can easily import into Arena if you want to try the deck out for yourself. And as usual, I'm not going to be reading out the text on every single card, otherwise the video would go on for ages. So if you don't know what any of the cards do, just quickly pause the video, fire up the Scryfall link, and have a quick read of any of the cards that you're unfamiliar with. So with that one out of the way, like I said, this is my red-green Turbo-Emissary deck in Historic. And the way this deck works is that we're trying to use Transmogrify or Indomitable Creativity to cheat Serra's Emissary into play on turn 3 or 4. So Transmogrify, 4 mana sorcery, we exile target creature, and then that creature's controller goes through their deck until they hit a creature and they put that into play. So the way this works with Serra's Emissary is we have a bunch of cards in the deck that non-creature cards in the deck that either create creature tokens, turn into creatures, or create artifact tokens as well. So Verdant Command creates creature tokens, Careful Cultivation creates a creature token, and Fable of the Mirror Breaker and Jugan Defends the Temple both create creature tokens and then transform into creatures. So we can use Transmogrify on any of our creature tokens or enchantments that transform into creatures, and we'll always get a Serra's Emissary onto the battlefield. Now, Indomitable Creativity does something very similar. Triple red does make it a bit more difficult to cast, but it does have 2 upsides over Transmogrify. First of all, we can target artifacts and creatures, which is nice because the big weakness of Transmogrify is that it's vulnerable to instant speed creature removal. Because if the opponent has mana up, they can just kill the creature that we target with Transmogrify in response to it, which will stop us getting the Emissary, which is a bit of a disaster. So the fact that we can target artifacts instead of creatures makes this a little bit safer because artifact removal, especially in best of 1, isn't very common. So we have both Strike It Rich and the 2/2 token that we get off Fable of the Mirror Breaker can both produce treasure tokens that we can use with creativity. So that's one slight upside. And the other upside of creativity is that we can destroy more than one creature or artifact. So if we have 5 or 6 mana, we can use creativity for X equals 2 or 3, and we can get multiple Serra's Emissaries into play, which is really powerful. And also don't forget that you can target your opponent's stuff with this. So if the opponent has a problematic creature or artifact on the battlefield, we can also target their stuff as well. So, Ceres Emissary itself is a super powerful creature, especially in Best of 1. 7 mana 7/7 with flying, and as it enters the battlefield we choose a card type, and you and creatures you control have protection from the chosen card type. So what this means by card type is, for example, creature, instant, sorcery, planeswalker, enchantment, artifact, etc. And the really powerful thing about this card is that it completely shuts off the opponent using that type of card against you. So this is particularly important against creatures, because if you put Ceres Emissary onto the battlefield naming creature, not only can the opponent's creatures, or they won't deal damage to your creatures, but more importantly they won't deal damage to you. So that means that if the opponent is just playing an aggressive creature deck, we can just shut off their creatures doing damage entirely. And on top of that, they also can't block any of our creatures. So the great thing about Emissary, especially in Best of 1, is a lot of the aggro decks, because they're particularly linear, you know, one of the big differences between Best of 3 and Best of 1 is that most Best of 1 decks are a lot more linear and a lot more low to the ground and focused on what their game plan is. So, like I said, a lot of the aggressive creature decks won't actually have any way in their deck to remove the Ceres Emissary, which means we basically just win the game at that point. You know, if they don't have a way to kill it, we basically just win the game. And even if they do have ways to kill it, they're typically going to be run in kind of low numbers. And so the other great thing about Emissary is, since we're getting it down on turn 3 or 4, not only are we locking the opponent out from attacking, but we're attacking in for 7 every turn, so which is obviously a really fast clock. So even if the opponent does have ways to remove the Emissary, we don't really give them much time to find that, because we're dealing 7 every turn, and they can't block it if we name creature. Additionally, since Emissary isn't legendary, we can get multiples on the battlefield. So that means that, you know, against a creature deck, we can put one onto the battlefield naming creature to stop them attacking with creatures, and then if we have a second Transmogrify, or we're using creativity for X=2, we can get a second one onto the battlefield, naming whatever we think their removal spell is likely to be. So usually against creature decks, you want to name creature first and then instant. In terms of naming stuff of Emissary, that is probably the biggest decision point of the game with this deck, and you do need to stop and think very carefully when you're naming stuff. Like I said, I'm pretty sure that 3 or 4 of my losses so far with this deck have just been from me punting and naming the wrong thing on this, so you do need to think very carefully about it. Like I say, against creature decks, you typically want to name creature first and then instant. But there are some situations where you might want to name instant first. So against a deck like Is It Phoenix, for example, if you're in a situation where the opponent isn't threatening to kill you with creatures, then and you have a way to get a second Emissary on the battlefield, like maybe you have 2 Transmogrifies in hand, then it might be better off to name instant first to stop them using stuff like Fading Hope or Unholy Heat to kill it, and then we can get the second Emissary onto the battlefield, then naming creature, and then we've completely locked the game down. In terms of naming other stuff, most of the removal spells, or the single target removal spells in the format that can kill Emissary, will be instant. The only time that you really want to name sorcery is against Reanimator. They commonly run a card called Bone Shards, which is a sorcery speed removal. And then the other removal spell that I've seen occasionally that's an instant is Bloodchief's Thirst, that occasionally Arcanist decks will run. But outside of that, there's very few single target sorcery speed removal spells that people run in the format, so you primarily want to be naming instant. The one thing you need to be notable, or the one thing you need to know when playing Emissary, is that naming sorcery doesn't stop sweepers from working. So if the opponent has like a Wrath of God or a Day of Judgment, an unconditional sweeper, that will just sweep your board. You can't stop that with Emissary. Speaking of which, against the control decks, since they're obviously not going to be running many creatures, you typically want to be naming Instant or Planeswalker. Instant obviously shuts down stuff like Fateful Absence or Commit to Memory to deal with your Emissary, and Planeswalker is to stop stuff like Teferi, Hero of Dominaria tucking it, or Teferi, Time Raveler from bouncing it. And then there will also be some corner case scenarios where you'll name Enchantment or Artifact. So for example, against the Enchantress decks, unless you're being threatened by creatures, so if they have like a Sanctum Weaver and a Destiny Spinner, you might want to name creature just to stop them animating their lands and killing you. But typically you want to name Enchantment first, because their removal is enchantment based. They'll be having stuff like Banishing Light or Borrowed Time in their deck, which they can also tutor up with Sterling Grove. So typically against Enchantress you want to name Enchantment. And then there will be some cases against Affinity where you name Artifact because of the new card Moonsnare Prototype. They can channel the Moonsnare Prototype to put Emissary back on top of the deck, And since a lot of their creatures, or the vast majority of the creatures in their deck, will be artifact creatures, you can often get away with naming artifact if you're worried about Moonsnare prototype, but you do need to be aware that both Nettle Cyst that creates a token, the token that it creates isn't an artifact, and the 2-mana white card that searches their artifacts from the top of their deck. I can't remember the name of it, but that's also not an artifact. So there are some corner case scenarios where you name other types, but typically, especially against creature decks, you want to name creature and instant. Now you might be wondering why I'm running this particular build over other creativity builds that have been around for a while now. There's been blue, red and Jeskai creativity decks that are more controlling. And the reason that I really like this particular build, especially in best of 1, is because we can pretty consistently get Emissary out on turn 3, which is really important. And the reason for that is that best of 1 historic really feels like a turn 4 format to me. And what I mean by that is, first of all, there are a lot of aggro decks that can pretty consistently kill on turn 4. Embercleave decks, Is It Phoenix and Elves can all pretty consistently kill on turn 4. But more importantly, most of the combo decks in the format are also killing on turn 4. So a couple of examples is the Dragonstorm Ultimatum deck is trying to cast Dragonstorm on turn 4 off Mizzix's Mastery or Unburial Rites on Scholar of the Lost Troves, and then they win with an infinite damage loop using Terror of the Peaks and Bladewing the Arisen. And then another example is one of the newer combo decks in the format, the Greasefang Parhelion deck. They can get Parhelion back on turn 3 with Greasefang, but they're only dealing 13 damage on turn 3. They don't actually kill until turn 4. Now the great thing about our deck against both of those decks is that if we can get Serra's Emissary out naming creature, it completely shuts off their combo. They can't deal damage with to us off the Terror of the Peaks or off their Parhelion if we have Emissary naming creature. But the big problem with that is if we go second, they're going to be comboing off and killing us before we get the chance to get Emissary out if we're relying on using Transmogrify or Creativity on turn 4. Similarly against the aggressive decks, if we're going second and they kill us on turn 4 before we get Emissary out, that's a disaster. So being able to get a Serra's Emissary onto the battlefield on turn 3 is so important at being able to win those matchups when we're going second. And that's the most important thing about this deck. It has multiple ways to get turn 3 Emissary out, which enables us to win going second. And additionally, if we're going first and we can get a turn 3 Emissary out, that's just going to get us way ahead of the opponent. So how do we Creativity on turn 3 or Transmogrify on turn 3? Well, the first and easiest way is with a new card from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, which is Careful Cultivation. So we're very rarely going to be playing this for the enchantment side. We're almost always going to be using it for the channel ability. So the way this works is turn 2, we hold 2 mana up and pass to the opponent's turn, and then at the end of their turn we can channel this and get a 1/1 Mana Dork into play. Then on turn 3 we just play our 3rd land for turn, we can tap the Mana Dork for mana, plus our 3 lands is 4 mana, and then we can use that 4 mana on Transmogrify or Creativity, targeting the Mana Dork we got off it, and we get an Emissary down on turn 3. Then the other methods we've got in the deck all rely on Strike It Rich. So Strike It Rich is a 1-mana sorcery, creates a treasure token, and then we can flash it back for 3. So first of all, this is really nice with Creativity, because like I said, being able to target artifacts with Creativity makes it a lot safer than targeting creatures. So the fact it creates artifacts Creativity is nice. Additionally, the treasure tokens can be used to hardcast Serra's Emissary if we draw it, because Strike It Rich can create 2 treasures just off 1 card, and the 2/2 that we get off Fable of the Mirror Breaker also creates treasures when it attacks. So it's not too difficult to get 3 treasures down to allow us to hardcast Serra's Emissary. But like I said, the most important thing about this card is that it allows us to combo off on turn 3 and get an Emissary into play. So the first way that we can do this is by going Strike It Rich on turn 1. Then on turn 2, we can play Verdant Command, which puts 2 1/1 tokens into play. And then on turn 3, we play our 3rd land for turn, and we have 4 mana. We have our 3 lands plus the treasure. We can use Transmogrify or Creativity on the Verdant Command tokens and get an Emissary into play. The second way we can get a turn 3 Emissary down is by going turn 1 Strike It Rich, and then turn 2 we use our treasure to cast Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which puts a 2/2 token into play. Then going into our turn 3, we get to discard and draw 2, which is helpful at making sure that we hit our 3rd land drop, as well as digging for Transmogrify or Creativity if we need to. We can attack in with the 2/2 token, which then generates a treasure token, and then we use that treasure token plus our 3 lands to play Transmogrify or Creativity on the 2/2 and get an Emissary into play. Now obviously this isn't foolproof because it relies on our 2/2 being able to attack and survive, but you'd be surprised at the amount of board states where the opponent either doesn't have any creatures on the battlefield, or their creatures are tapped from attacking, or the creature that they have is too small. And even in scenarios where the opponent has something like a 3/3 on the battlefield, if you feel you have to go for the turn 3 combo, you can often just attack anyway, and a lot of the time the opponent just won't block because they think you have a combat trick or something. So it's not foolproof, this method, but it does work in a lot of cases. And then the third method is turn 1 Strike It Rich, turn 2 Jugan defends the temple, which creates a 1/1 mana dork when it enters the battlefield. And then on turn 3 we play our third land for turn. We can tap the mana dork that we got off Jugan for 1 mana, plus our 3 lands is 4 mana. We can use Transmogrify or Creativity on the token and get the turn 3 Emissary. So we have a lot of ways and a lot of potential hands where we can get turn 3 Emissary down. And like I said, that's so important going second, and if we can get it off going first, it puts us so far ahead that we're usually going to win the game anyway. So let's have a look at some of the other cards in the deck in a bit more detail. So Verdant Command is a really nice card. So it's a 2 mana instant with 4 modes, and we get to pick 2 of them. So first of all, the ability to create 2 tapped 1/1 green scroll tokens is really important for both our Transmogrify and our Creativity. Obviously this is just a way to create the tokens that we can use with our Transmogrify or Creativity to get an Emissary into play. Don't forget that these enter tapped, so you can't use them to block the opponent's creatures in combat. The second ability to counter a loyalty ability of a Planeswalker, I didn't think would come up that much, but it's actually really important in a lot of situations. So first of all, against control, like I said, we're usually going to be naming Instant and Planeswalker off the Emissary, but if we have a Verdant Command and we're getting an early Emissary down, we can often get away with naming Instant on Emissary, and then we can use the Verdant Command to counter Teferi's Tuck ability. So if we have Verdant Command and Emissary, we kind of essentially have protection from Instants and Planeswalkers as well, because we can just play the Verdant Command at instant speed, counter the Teferi minus, and do another mode as well. Now you do need to be aware with Verdant Command that if you name Instant on Serra's Emissary, you can't target yourself for any of the modes, so you won't be able to give yourself 1/1s or gain any life. So if you do end up naming Instant on Emissary and use Verdant Command to counter a Teferi Tuck, for example, you do need to be aware that you'll have to either exile a card from a graveyard or gain the opponent 3 life or something like that. But just be aware of that, because I have lost games in the past where I have multiple Transmogrifies. I use the first one on Emissary naming Instant, and then I forget that I can't make tokens off the Verdant Command, and because I can't make tokens, I can't use the second Transmogrify. So just be aware, you obviously can't target yourself if you name Instant on Emissary. The other times where countering the Planeswalker ability is really important is against sweeper Planeswalker abilities. So something like Ajani, Strength of the Pride, is something that we can't stop if we're against a Heliod combo deck, for example. A lot of the Heliod combo decks in Best of 1 will tend to run 1 copy of Ajani as a way to answer Serra's Emissary, and if they're comboing off with Trelasara, they can scry through their whole deck to put Ajani, Strength of the Pride to the top. So being able to counter the sweeper ability off Ajani with this is really nice. And additionally, Ugin is another card that can be problematic. They can play Ugin and go -7 to try and kill your emissaries, but we can obviously use Verdant Command to counter that as well. So countering the loyalty abilities actually comes up more than you'd expect. Then the third mode, to exile a card from a graveyard, is so nice to have, especially in Best of 1, because as I was describing earlier, the other combo decks in the format are pretty reliant on the graveyard. You know, the Dragonstorm decks, Parhelion decks, Reanimator decks, most of the combo decks in the format are relying on the graveyard. So even if we're going second and we don't have a way to get turn 3 Emissary, we can often use Verdant Command to counter what the opponent's doing. We can just keep mana up for it, and then the turn that they try and combo off, we can use Verdant Command to exile their Dragonstorm or exile their Emergent Ultimatum, and that can win you the game on its own. So having another way to shut off these graveyard-based combo decks is really nice. And then the fourth ability, to gain 3 life, again, super relevant against the aggressive decks as well. You know, if we're up against mono red or elves or just any deck like Is It Phoenix that's trying to attack us, gaining 3 life, especially off a 2 mana card, is great. So all 4 modes on this card are really relevant, and they come up quite a lot. Careful Cultivation, kind of explained this one already. There have been a few instances where I have played this as an enchantment, mainly when I've named instant against an Is It Phoenix deck and I just need to block their flying creatures. You know, you can put this on one of your tokens just to be able to block flyers, but for the most part we're just going to be using this for the channel ability. Then Fable of the Mirror Breaker. This card works so well in the creativity shell. So first mode creates a 2/2 that attacks and creates treasures. So same thing as I was saying about Strike It Rich applies here. Being able to create treasures is really great at having treasures lying around for indomitable creativity. Treasures are also great at being able to hard cast Serra's Emissary as well. And obviously the fact that this creates a token on the first mode is really important to be able to target with Transmogrify or Creativity the following turn. The second ability to discard 2 cards and draw 2 is also so nice in this deck because it allows us to, first of all, dig for lands if we need to, but it also allows us to dig for Transmogrify or Creativity. So if we're against a Thoughtseize deck, for example, and they strip Transmogrify or Creativity from our hand, we can use this to dig 2 cards deeper in our deck, and since we're running 8 copies of this effect, it's not too hard for us to find that second one. And the fact that we can choose not to do this also means that if we have everything we need, we don't have to bother cycling. And then the third mode, it exiles and then turns into Reflection of Kiki-Jiki. So first of all, this is just really nice because on a single card we get 2 creatures, which means that we can play this Creativity the following turn on the 2/2 token, and then when this hits the third chapter, we have another creature that we can also use with Transmogrify or Creativity. The creature itself is a 2/2, and we can pay 1 and tap it to make a token that's a copy of another non-legendary creature, except it has haste, and we sack it at the beginning of the next end step. So one thing to be aware of this is that because the saga exiles itself and enters the battlefield, Reflection of Kiki-Jiki does have summoning sickness, so you can't use the ability the turn that it transforms. But we can actually use this on Serra's Emissary to create extra tokens. Now you do need to be aware that if you name creature or enchantment on Serra's Emissary, you can't target it with the Reflection of Kiki-Jiki because obviously it already has protection from creatures or enchantments, so you won't be able to target it. But if you name instant, sorcery, planeswalker or artifact, you know, normally this comes up when you name instant, we can make copies of Emissary at instant speed. So first of all, this is really nice at forcing through lethal damage. You know, say we have Emissary on instant and we have we have Reflection of Kiki-Jiki out. We can, during our main phase, pay 1, tap it, make a copy of Emissary naming creature, and then we have 14 damage at least attacking that turn, and the opponent can't block because we have an Emissary on creature. But more importantly, we can also make emissaries at instant speed. So say we have Emissary on instant, and we pass to the opponent's turn with an untapped Reflection. If the opponent then tries to use a sorcery speed removal on our Emissary, we can make a copy of the Emissary at instant speed, naming sorcery, which will make their removal spell fizzle. And then even outside of copying Emissary, we can also use this to copy other creature tokens just to give us a faster clock. So Fable of the Mirror Breaker for 3 mana gives us so much value in this deck and really synergizes with what we're doing quite a lot. Then Jugan Defends the Temple. Another 3 mana saga. It creates a mana dork on the first mode. Then on the second mode, it puts 2 counters on a creature, which is, you know, it doesn't really make that much of a difference in a lot of situations, but it's nice upside. And then on the third mode, it enters play as a new creature. So like Fable of the Mirror Breaker, the fact that we get a creature token going into turn 4, and then we get another creature when it flips as well, gives us an extra target for the second copy of Transmogrify or Creativity that we might have. But additionally, this also does provide us with a way to play a fair game plan that doesn't rely on the Emissary, which is one of the things that I really like about this as upgrades to the deck, in that you can play a fair game plan. You know, I've won games against the Arcanist deck, for example, where they Thoughtseize away Transmogrify or Creativity, and then I can just win playing these cards fairly and generating value. Because the problem with these Transmogrify decks in the past, before Kamigawa came out, was that most of the token generators that you had to run were usually just 2 mana, create 2 1/1s, and that was all the value you got. Whereas the advantage of these cards is that you actually get quite a lot more value, and you can actually play a fair game plan. So once you have Remnant of the Rising Star out, any other creature tokens that you play, you can just tap all of the mana you have available and make them into really big creatures, which does allow you to beat down against the discard or controlling decks as well. Then at 4 mana, we've also got 3 copies of Chandra, Torch of Defiance. Now this is here, first of all, as a way to kind of help the control matchup a little bit. I will say that Ceres Emissary is probably at its weakest against control compared to the creature decks, because first of all, the unconditional sweepers do kill it, and second of all, they do tend to have a wide variety of card types that can interact with stuff. So, you know, you might name instant, but then they have a Teferi. You might name Planeswalker, and then they have an instant. You might name both, and then they end up having a Shark Typhoon. So Emissary can be a bit sketchy against control in certain matchups, and Chandra really helps out there. The other great thing about Chandra in this deck is because we're so focused on being able to transmogrify or creativity on turn 3, that also means that we can often ramp into Chandra on turn 3. And having a Chandra on turn 3 is no joke. It can win a game on its own, especially in best of 1. So Chandra is great at just giving us another avenue of attack and also shoring up the control matchup as well. Then the mana base, we're running 25 lands, which is obviously slightly higher than you'd expect in best of 1, but considering the most important cards in the deck are all 4 mana, we really want to be making sure that we're hitting our 4th land drop as often as possible. In terms of the actual lands themselves, we're running 12 of the red-green dual lands, and these are so important because the curve out of having careful cultivation into turn 3 creativity relies on us having triple red lands and green. You know, if we have, for example, if we have, for example, Mountain, and then we have to play a Cragcrown Pathway on green to play the channel ability of Careful Cultivation, we can't then play Creativity on turn 3 because the mana dork we get off Careful Cultivation can only tap for green. So having these red-green dual lands is so important at enabling us to go Careful Cultivation into turn 3 Creativity, and that's the reason why I'm not running any lands that just produce green, like any forests or Besaidus or anything like that. In terms of the other lands that we're running, 2 Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance is really good in this deck because it acts as just a mountain that can also create 2 1/1 tokens, and obviously with Transmogrify or Creativity, being able to create 1/1 tokens fits into the game plan perfectly. Not running any more than 2 because you really don't want to be drawing multiples of it. It is a legendary land. And the reason I'm not running any Den of the Bugbear is because, like I said, these red-green dual lands are so important for cultivation into creativity. We're having to run Rootbound Crag, which does require us to run a high number of mountains and stomping grounds to ensure that this is entering play untapped as often as possible. So that's the deck. It's been so powerful for me. It can be quite tricky to play. You do need to think a lot about the cards you name off creative, or the card type you're naming off creativity, but this has felt like possibly the strongest best of 1 deck I've played in a very, very long time. I do want to talk briefly about best of 3 with this deck, because I did build it specifically for best of 1, but I thought I would test it in best of 3 just to see how it would do, and it was reasonable in best of 3, but the big problem with this deck is that it's very reliant on Ceres Emissary being able to hold the fort. You know, the big difference between this and the controlling creativity decks is we're giving up the ability to protect the Emissary just for pure speed, and I think that works really well in best of 1, but in best of 3, every deck I feel that's built well is going to have some kind of answer for Ceres Emissary, so the opponent is going to have a way to kill it, which means that relying on your Emissary holding the fort down when we don't really have good ways to protect it, we're not running any counter spells, is a bit more of a flimsy strategy. And also additionally, playing on ladder, what you name on the Emissary games 2 and 3 can feel like a bit of a lottery. So for example, I was playing a best of 3 match against Auras recently. Game 1 I got a turn 3 Emissary down and the opponent just conceded immediately. Game 2 I got 2 Emissaries out, 1 naming creature and 1 naming enchantment to play around Heliod's punishment, but the opponent had boarded in Fateful Absence, which is an instant, so they obviously used that to kill my Emissary and then won the game. And then game 3, got 2 Emissaries out, 1 naming creature, 1 naming instant this time, and they had the Heliod's punishment. Similarly, I was playing against an Enchantress deck and I lost post board because I had 1 Emissary on creature and 1 on enchantment, and I thought that they would be running like a Wrath of God or Day of Judgment as removal, so I was playing around that, but instead they boarded in Calyx as the Planeswalker, and so you end up losing games just because you don't have knowledge of what removal the opponent has access to in the sideboard. So this might actually be a reasonable choice in best of 3 if you're playing an open decklist tournament and you can make more informed decisions about what you name on creativity. But on the ladder, when the opponent could have access to any weird removal in the sideboard that you don't know, Emissary becomes a lot less reliable, whereas in best of 1, it's so good, especially when you can race it out. So anyway, that's the deck. If you've got any questions at all, drop me a comment below. And now onto the gameplay. Thankfully, since it's best of one, I can include more number of matches in here. So I've got a few matches that I was playing on the ladder for you guys so you can see the deck in action. So I hope you enjoy. Big up. Okay, so we're going first. Don't have a Transmogrifier Creativity, so we have to mull that. This is definitely a keep. Just trying to think what we put back. I think we definitely want the 3 lands. And I think we'll keep both Transmogrifiers, because against the Lurrus deck, if they're playing Arcanist, they're much more likely to want to take Transmogrify, and we have a lot more ways to create tokens than Transmogrify effects. And the other bonus of this, you know, we'll obviously pass and hold up the channel for Careful Cultivation, but we have a second Transmogrify for a second Emissary here. So blue and white lands with Lurrus, this is almost definitely going to be Auras. I'm glad they tap out here, because that means that we don't have to worry about Spell Pierce or Mana Tithe or anything like that. So we're guaranteed to get an Emissary down here. Pretty sure we'll name Creature on the first one. And then we have the second Transmogrify here to name Enchantment to stop Heliod's Punishment, which is nice. So if we draw another land, we can Sokenzan next turn, and then Transmogrify the following turn, naming Enchantment, and that'll hopefully lock the game out. If we don't draw another land, we can just play Sokenzan and play Chandra, which is pretty reasonable as well. You know, they don't have many turns to find the Heliod's Punishment, so we'll see. I mean, obviously, since they have SRAM, they do get a lot of draws. Now they have Spirit Dance, so they'll get even more draws, so... Okay, Sentinel's Eyes... See what we draw here. Okay, Cultivation's nice, so we can play the Sokenzan and then we can just use the channel ability of Careful Cultivation and then Transmogrify into Enchantment. So we're only really worried about either a counterspell like Spell Pierce or them killing us this turn. You know, if they somehow have like... They need Heliod's Punishment and All That Glitters and something else. Okay, so they have the Heliod's Punishment, so we want to see them tap out here. So they don't have access to Spell Pierce, but we also don't want them to get lethal damage, obviously. Okay, so Curious Obsession taps their blue mana down, which is nice. I mean, we might be able to play around Spell Pierce. If we draw our land here, we can play around Spell Pierce anyway. Okay, let's see. If they draw like an island and have Spell Pierce here, it could be rough. Okay, sweet. So we should win here then, because we can Transmogrify this token, naming Enchantment, which will then make the Heliod's Punishment fall off our other Emissary. So we'll tap this for green mana, Transmogrify the token, we'll pay the Sentinel tax, and I mean there's a chance they might have instant speed removal, but in best of one, you know, I expect people to be playing a lot more linear. They're not really likely to be running non-enchantment removal, so I imagine this should be good enough to win, hopefully. We'll see. Okay, they're still playing on, so maybe they do have like a Fateful Absence in their deck somewhere. Okay, they play Light Pause. I don't think there's any enchantments they can search off that can kill Emissary that I'm aware of. Staggering Insight. Okay, sweet, we got there. Nice. Okay, a little bit slow and we're missing our third land, but I think we can keep this. You know, we do unfortunately have both of our lands entering play tapped, but as things stand, we don't have anything to play on the first couple turns anyway, so I think this is reasonable, and as long as we draw our third land before turn 3, we're in decent shape, because the great thing about Fable and Jugan is that they both provide extra mana or help us dig for lands. So Strike It Rich, if we're not going to draw a land, that's the next best thing. At least it guarantees that we can play Fable or Jugan next turn, which helps us get mana. Okay. Careful Cultivation is an interesting one. I'm just trying to think whether to play one of the Sagas or just hold up Cultivation. I think it's probably better to just hold up Cultivation here to play around removal. You know, they could have Creature plus Primal Might or something, so... Llanowar Tribe. So Explore and Llanowar Tribe makes me think they're probably on some Nissa ramp pile. Okay, land is great because it means we don't have to use our treasure token to transmogrify here. And I think we're just naming creature here. You know, even though we think, well, you know, we could name Planeswalker, but that doesn't really do anything against the green decks because Nissa, all of the power comes from the animated lands, which we get protection from naming creature anyway. We're obviously worried about Ugin, potentially, so drawing a Verdant Command would be great, but other than that, I think we're in a decent position here. Now, we could play Chandra, but it doesn't get protection from creatures, so I think we'll just play Fable of the Mirror Breaker here to increase the clock. Oh, whoops. Oh, that was stupid. I completely forgot that Vorinclex stops sagas from working. That was my bad. So I should have played Chandra there. Like, it would have died, but we could have at least got in for an extra 2 points of damage. Or we could have potentially killed the Llanowar tribe. That would have probably been better, actually. Okay, so they do have Nissa, and because of Vorinclex, it ends his play with 10 loyalty. Okay, they ultimate it. I mean, The only thing we're really worried about here is Ugin, I think. You know, Ulamog can take our lands out, but I think we can still race it because they can't do any damage with it. They can obviously exile our deck, but we're killing in 2 turns. So they would have needed an Ulamog this turn, really. Oh, well, okay, perfect. That's exactly what we want to draw here, because the thing we lose to is Ugin, and we can use Verdant Command to counter Ugin's minus. Now, since they do have 18 lands in play, we do lose to double Ugin, but, you know, that's whatever. If they have double Ugin, then we can't play around that, really. Okay, so they do have the Ugin, so that top deck last turn was so clutch. So I assume they just -7 here, yeah. So we'll counter the ability, and I definitely think we'll put 2 1/1s into play because we need to kill this turn, and there's a possibility they have a way to gain life. So if they gain life here, and we can't kill with Emissary, they can. Okay, yes. So yeah, exactly. Gilded Goose is exactly the sort of thing I was thinking about. Because if we don't kill here, they can -7 again, and we basically just can't beat that. You know, they'd have 2 6/6s with Indestructible. So hopefully they don't have another way to gain life. I think we have exact lethal even if they sack the food here. So that Verdant Command was the perfect card to draw. Sweet. Okay, sweet, here we go. So going first here, and yeah, I think this is decent. We obviously want to, well, we obviously need to hit our 3rd land, but once we hit our 3rd land, I think we're pretty good here, you know. Fable of the Mirror Breaker can help us dig for our 4th land. We could just play Jugan and use the Mana Dork to have access to 4th mana. So yeah, sweet, we got our 3rd land now. We can Verdant Command at the end of the opponent's turn to get 2 1/1s into play, which is nice. Okay, so it looks like the opponent's on control here. We'll just fire off Verdant Command, make a couple of 1/1s and gain 3 life here. And then, I'm trying to think whether we want to go for Fable of the Mirror Breaker or Jugan. I mean, they're unlikely. Well, they could have Censor or Jwari Disruption here, but I think the upside of getting Fable of the Mirror Breaker into play is a lot higher. If they don't have a Censor or Jwari Disruption, Fable of the Mirror Breaker presents, well, it applies a lot more pressure, and it helps us dig for lands, which we might need as well. Okay, sweet, it does resolve, which is great. You know, now we have 4 power into play, which, you know, it's a pretty aggressive start here. Okay, they have Shark Typhoon. Let's see what they do here. They could have Divine Purge, which would be kind of annoying, but then if we draw a land for turn, we can play Chandra. Okay, so they just pass with open mana here, so obviously they could have a counter spell. I think we'll discard Jugan here. Okay, we hit another land, that's not too bad. And I think we'll definitely attack first. Okay, so the opponent's obviously thinking about something here. If they're stopping here, it makes me think they probably have Archmage's Charm, and they're trying to decide whether they want to take control of this 2/2 before we can make a treasure or not. You know, it obviously stops us attacking. If they do that, we're pretty happy because then we can just play Stomping Ground and play Chandra while they're tapped out, and then we can use the minus on Chandra to kill the 2/2. If they let us attack and hold up Archmage's Charm, I think that's also decent for us because our goal here, I think, is to try and make them tap out for a sweeper next turn. So if they let us attack, we get a treasure token, then we can play Chandra main phase 2, and if they counter it, then that's whatever. If they don't have a sweeper, we're dealing 4 every turn, and if they do have a sweeper, we can then creativity for x equals 2 on our treasure and the reflection of Kiki Jiki that's going to be flipping next turn. So I think either way, it's pretty decent here. Now, okay, we do get to attack. We could go for Transmogrify here instead of Chandra, but that makes their creature removal live. You know, if we go Transmogrify and they have Fateful Absence or Brazen Borrower, they're much less likely to sweep next turn. They're much more likely to hold up counter magic. Okay, so they do have counter spells. So the idea is we're trying to bait them into sweeping here. Sweet, which they do. Perfect. So now we can, you know, the Fable of the Mirror Breaker flips into the reflection of Kiki Jiki. We can play our 5th land, and now we can creativity for x equals 2, naming instant and planeswalker. And then if the opponent doesn't have another sweeper here, we should be good to win. You know, if they don't have like a Shark Typhoon or a sweeper here, we just win next turn anyway because we have exactly 14 power in play. Now obviously a second Wrath of God is kind of a disaster here, but you know, I don't think we can really afford to be playing around 2 sweepers. And the upside of this play is if they don't have it, then we just win next turn anyway. You know, even if they have a Shark Typhoon, then they're down to 7, and they can't use Planeswalkers or Instants to kill either of these, so they have to dig for another sweeper. Let's see what they got here. They can't even use Settle the Wreckage because we have protections from Instants, so they can't target us for it. So, okay, sweet, we got there. Nice. Okay, I mean it's a little bit slow, but we have enough lands. We've got Jugan to make a token on turn 3, and we have turn 4 creativity, so I think we have to keep this. And you know, there are a lot of good draws. If we draw Careful Cultivation or Strike It Rich, we can combo off on turn 3. Obviously having a Serra's Emissary isn't ideal, but we're running 4 in the deck for this sort of reason, so... Okay, Transmogrify is not the worst draw here. Watery Grave could be control, could be... I mean, it could be a lot of things. There's Esper Reanimator, there's Esper Parhelion, there's control. So yeah, it looks like we're just going for a turn 3 Jugan into turn 4 Transmogrify. Huh, Careful Cultivation's an interesting one. I'm just trying to think whether we play Jugan here or try and Careful Cultivation during the opponent's turn. I think I'm probably just going to go for Jugan here. They could have a counter spell, but if it resolves, we get a lot more upside on this. We get 2 creatures off it. We're being more mana efficient as well. Mirror Shell Crab. Okay, they've got a counter spell. Still not 100% sure what they're playing here. Could still be Reanimator, could be control. So I think we'll just pass here, and we'll Sokenzan, and then if we draw another land, we can potentially creativity for x equals 2 if the opponent taps out here. Even if they don't, we can transfer. Okay, so they are playing Reanimator, nice. So that means that we get a window to combo off here. We'll definitely use Sokenzan here because there's much higher upside. If we do draw a land, we can get 2 emissaries into play here, whereas if we just play Careful Cultivation, we can only get 1. Nice, okay, so we did draw the land. So I think here we're going to be naming Creature and Sorcery. You know, against Reanimator, they typically run Bone Shards as their removal rather than anything else. Against most other decks you want to name Instant, but this is one of the few matchups where I think it's better to name Sorcery. Now these sorts of games do become a bit of a nightmare if the opponent can also get a Serra's Emissary onto the battlefield. We do have creativity to kill it, but if we hit another Serra's Emissary or we hit an Ulamog or something, we could end up losing. So we'll just see. Okay, nice, we got there. Okay, sweet. We're going first here. No transmogrifier creativity, so we have to mull, unfortunately. And yeah, this looks great. Can put back an emissary, and we've got pretty nice turn 3 creativity here. Okay, I was going to say it is pretty weak to Thoughtseize this hand, but thankfully the opponent looks like they're on mono red, so we do want them to attack with Firebrand. If they hold up the Firebrand, that could be problematic because they can kill our Mana Dork off the Careful Cultivation here, but I imagine they'll probably attack. Yeah, sweet. So we're getting off, you know, turn 3 Emissary naming creature against mono red is almost always going to be good enough to win. Now they are likely running Bone Crusher Giant, which can get around the protection that Emissary provides, because the way protection works is it prevents the damage, and the stomp on Bone Crusher Giant says damage can't be prevented. But since we're getting this down on turn 3, you know, for them to win with Stomp off Bone Crusher Giant, we'd have to be at a reasonably low life total anyway, because they have to kill that turn. So the fact we got Emissary out on turn 3 here is huge. So we'll attack him for 8 here, and then I think we'll just make 2 treasures with our open mana. So yeah, the only way the opponent's really going to win here is if they build up a big enough board and have Stomp off Bone Crusher Giant, which I think is pretty unlikely. You know, we're killing them pretty handily in 2 turns here. Okay, Tool Run is quite scary. I was going to say we might have to keep the token held back here because it doesn't increase our clock in any way, but since we drew Transmogrify here, I think we'll attack him with both, and then we can just Transmogrify the token, and I think we'll probably just name Instant here, because if they do have Bone Crusher Giant, if we name Instant, they then have to target one of their own things with the Bone Crusher Giant. You know, they can target one of their own creatures or themselves with Stomp, and they still get the damage can't be prevented off, but I still don't think it'll be enough on this board. We can just block their biggest creature with the Emissary here, so... Okay, another Firebrand. So, I mean, if they have Embercleave and Stomp here, that might be enough, but doesn't look very likely to me. Looks like they got something, but I'm just not sure what it is. Ah, maybe they... Okay, no, sweet. Alright, we got there.